to chapter 6, titled Sankhya Yoga. And actually, chapter 6 is the last chapter in the first part of the Bhagavad Gita. Specifically, chapter 6 is about controlling the mind. And Krishna explains that if we start to learn to control our mind, it will lead to a happier life. Nowadays, there are many books and courses about positive thinking and developing our full potential, how to bring about the best in us for living a successful material life. But the essence of Bhagavad Gita is about bringing out the best in us through acquired spiritual knowledge and realization. So with these 47 verses, I've divided them into 7 segments so we can look at the 7 subjects as we're progressing through the chapter. And I've pulled out 19 verses that elaborate on these segments. So let's begin now with the first segment, which is the opening segue and an elaboration of the last 2 verses of chapter 5. So in the last chapter, titled Karma Yoga, Krishna was giving a description of a yogi, and specifically he was describing the yogi who works in devotion. Therefore, stepping into chapter 6, he carries on for a few verses now this description. He's outlining renunciation. So he's defining the yogi even more now. So we'll look at verse 2. What is called renunciation is the same as yoga, or linking oneself with the Supreme. For no one can become a yogi unless he renounces the desire for sense gratification. So then Krishna continues and he begins to explain the importance of controlling the mind. Here are 2 verses. Verse 5. A man must elevate himself by his own mind, not degrade himself. The mind is the friend of the conditioned soul and his enemy as well. Verse 6. For him who has conquered the mind is the best of friends. But for one who has failed to do so, his very mind will be the greatest enemy. Now in the third segment, Krishna describes the Ashtanga yoga system, how one sits, how one thinks, how one sees things outside of the body, and how one relates to others. So we will look at 3 of these verses, verse 11 to 12. To practice yoga, one should go to a secluded place and should lay kusa grass on the ground and then cover it with a deer skin and a soft cloth. The seat should neither be too high nor too low and should be situated in a sacred place. The yogi should then sit on it very firmly and should practice yoga by controlling the mind and the senses, purifying the heart and fixing the mind on one point. Verse 16. There is no possibility of one's becoming a yogi, O Arjuna, if one eats too much or eats too little, sleeps too much or does not sleep enough. Verse 17. He who is temperate in his habits of eating, sleeping, working, and recreation can mitigate all material pains by practicing the yoga system. Then in the 4th segment, Krishna describes the nature of the mind. Verse 19. As a lamp in a windless place does not waver, so the transcendentalist whose mind is controlled remains always steady in his meditation on the transcendental self. Verse 26. From whatever and wherever the mind wanders, due to its flickering and unsteady nature, one must certainly withdraw it and bring it back under the control of the self. As I mentioned at the beginning, so Krishna is explaining about the mind and how it's necessary to control the senses, to control the mind, in order to be happier in life, so that the mind is your friend, not your enemy. So now in the 5th segment, it is here now that Arjuna makes some statements about the mind and asks questions. In fact, so far in the Bhagavad Gita, this is really where Arjuna is asking quite a lot of questions about the mind. So verse 33, Arjuna said, O Madhusudan, the system of yoga which you have summarized appears impractical and unendurable to me, for the mind is restless and unsteady. 34. For the mind is restless, turbulent, obstinate, and very strong, O Krishna, and to subdue it is, it seems to me, more difficult than controlling the wind. 37. Arjuna said, what is the destination of the man of faith who does not persevere, who in the beginning takes to the process of self-realization, but who later desists due to worldly mindedness and thus does not attain perfection in mysticism? O mighty armed Krishna, does not such a man, being deviated from the path of transcendence, perish like a riven cloud with no position in any sphere? This is my doubt, O Krishna, and I ask you to dispel it completely. But for yourself, no one is to be found who can destroy this doubt. So this is very wonderful what Arjuna is now. He's making statements and he's asking questions because he's saying how strong the mind is and what happens if we can't do that. What happens if we fail in this process, in this lifetime? Was it all for nothing? So these are fantastic statements and questions by Arjuna. So in the 6th segment, Krishna addresses Arjuna's doubt and explains what happens to the unsuccessful yogi. Verse 40, the blessed Lord said, O son of Pritha, a transcendentalist engaged in auspicious activities does not meet with destruction, either in this world or in the spiritual world. One who does good, my friend, is never overcome by evil. The unsuccessful yogi, after many, many years of enjoyment on the planets of the pious living entities, is born into a family of righteous people, or into a family of rich aristocracy, or he takes his birth in a family of transcendentalists who are surely great in wisdom. Verily, such a birth is rare in this world. On taking such a birth, he again revives the divine consciousness of his previous life, and he tries to make further progress in order to achieve complete success, O son of Kuru. By virtue of the divine consciousness of his previous life, he automatically becomes attracted to the yogic principles, even without seeking them. Such an inquisitive transcendentalist, striving for yoga, stands always above the ritualistic principles of the scriptures. So this was a very encouraging answers that Krishna gave. Keep trying to do this because there's no loss. Everything is to be gained by doing it. If it's not in this lifetime, it can be in the next lifetime. Now for the last segment in chapter 6, in verse 47, Krishna says, and of all yogis, he who always abides in me with great faith, worshipping me in transcendental loving service, is most intimately united with me in yoga and is the highest of all. So this is a wonderful ending to this chapter. Not only has Krishna really set out the mind and how it can be a really great big obstacle in our spiritual life, but it can also be our friend. And don't give up. Whatever you can achieve, whatever you can try to do, that will bring results that will continue in your next life. But then he ends it off by starting to talk about himself. And this is a wonderful segue into chapter 7, which is the start of the next part of the Bhagavad Gita, where it's all about Krishna. Krishna's talking about himself. So until we meet for chapter 7, which is titled Knowledge of the Absolute, Namaste.